The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclex Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
This is, as you know, the fourth week of the festival. We've been doing this the entire month of October. And my name is Brian Baltosiewich. I'm with the Queen City Podcast Network here in Charlotte. I'll be your moderator for this hour of the Charlotte Podcast Festival and this discussion about kind of keeping it all together while you're doing a podcast, right? Your own sort of podcast mental health. This, of course, is Charlotte's first podcast festival. It's presented by WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the Queen City Podcast Network, Blumenthal Performing Arts, and Eclex Creative Agency. I'm going to introduce our panel in just a few moments, but first, I want to encourage you to leave questions in the chat room. Obviously, this is all about you and the questions that you have for us and the panelists, and so please do feel free to put questions in the chat room. We'll get your questions as soon as we possibly can, and we'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can. Please do leave your microphones muted for the session and put your questions, as we mentioned, in the chat room. This session will be recorded and made available over email later this week, actually. So make sure to check your emails, including your spam, junk, and promotions folders, to receive this session recording at the end of the festival. We also encourage you to check out the remaining sessions at the Charlotte Podcast Festival. Tonight we're talking about legal issues within podcasting, so things that legal considerations you might not have thought about, like, can you use copywritten music in a podcast, or do I need a release form for my podcast guests? These are the questions I get asked the most often. We are taking those questions. Landis Wade from the Charlotte Readers podcast will be here. He is, by his own terminology, a recovering attorney, and he's going to deal with all those questions tonight. You can check out the website, charlottepodcastfestival.com, for the remainder of the schedule. And you also, if you like what you're doing, you probably noticed that the fee for this entire podcast festival has been absolutely nothing. All of these sessions have been free. If you like what we're doing and you feel like you want to support us, you can do that by buying a spiffy Charlotte Podcast Festival t-shirt from the website at charlottepodcastfestival.com. All right, let's get this panel started before you all get burned out from listening to my voice. So we're talking about burnout and keeping it together in terms of your mental health. A lot of podcasts get started and then they fade out. They literally call it pod fade. They stop, podcast producers just stop producing their podcasts. Of the 1.2 million podcasts on Apple Podcasts right now, only about 250,000 have published anything in the last 3 months. Now, is that because of pod fade, or is it because of limited run podcasts that maybe they knew it was only going to be an episode run? But let's address the kind of the bigger issue of podcast mental health. So for this session, our guests for the session from the Two Elephants in the Room podcast, which focuses on reducing stigma of mental health, not just in podcasting, but on life in general. Erin, Steele, and Alicia Tetteh are here. Hey guys, thanks a lot for joining us.
Hi, thank you. It's Alicia Tetteh.
I'm sorry, Jesus. She told me it was pronounced pate, or like pate, and I went to my notes and I literally zoomed in on pate. I am an idiot. I apologize.
You're not an idiot, but that was a good icebreaker.
Yeah, that's exactly. Well, I can be counted on for breaking the ice, and my humble apologies, Alicia.
No problem.
Thank you guys for joining us. I appreciate it. Also joining us here for this panel from the Charlotte podcast, member of the Queen City Podcast Network, by the way, Miller Yoho and John Short are here. They are the hosts and producers of the Charlotte podcast. So I'm going to spotlight. There's Miller, and there's John. Say hi, John.
Hey, everybody.
And there's John. They are here too from the Charlotte podcast. They've been producing their video or their podcast a long time, and they can certainly address. They book their own guests, and they so they put a lot of work into their podcast. They can certainly address podcast burnout a little bit. Also joining us today, you've seen her on CNBC and in Time Magazine, and most recently on Good Morning America. Bernadette Joy is here. Hey, Bernadette, how are you?
Hello, how are you? Thanks for having me.
She is the host of the Crush Your Debt podcast and also Ask Bernadette Joy. And she's been quite some time as well and has a definite structure, but also a definite viewpoint given everything that she's done and what she's trying to accomplish with her podcast. Can talk about burnout in podcasting. So thank you guys for joining us. And I want to start here. I want to start by asking you, and let's see, Bernadette, we'll start with you and kind of work through the panel. Has there, in the time that you've been doing your podcast, has there been a moment when your podcast specifically and your attitude toward your podcast has been kind of like, what am I doing? And I don't know how long I can keep this up.
Yes. That's why I am probably here. So just to give a little bit of background, like Brian said, I'm Bernadette Joy, and I initially started this podcast. The first season was called Crush This Debt. And the intent was to entirely be one season, 10 episodes, and just be done. And I originally started the podcast selfishly because my podcast is based on the story of how my husband and I paid off initially $72,000 of debt in a year and then $300,000 of debt in 3 years. And people kept asking us how we did that. And I told my husband one day, I was like, it'd be way more efficient for me to just record my answer instead of having to go for like all of these cups of coffee and stuff. And then he said, that's called a podcast. I was like, oh, that's what that is. All right. So that's what I shall do. And so we recorded the first 10 episodes. I thought I was one and done with it. And I was like, oh, I actually really like this whole thing. And so I went for season 2, which went from a narrative story, like scripted and all of that from the first season to kind of the more traditional, conversational one. And that is where I found myself burning out because I went from, okay, this is a very, finite project. I know there's a beginning and end. And then when I went to the season 2 and season 3 of the interview style and wanting to put things out on a regular basis, that's when I found myself saying like, oh, do I still want to keep doing this? And I'll talk probably more about how I tackle that.
At what point then did you kind of think like, I'm not sure that I can keep did you not realize how much work a podcast is? And at some point, did you kind of think, I got to shut this down?
Yeah, season 2. So season 1, I think I was, really pumped because again, it was 10 episodes. There was a beginning, middle, and end. I had my producer who was helping me on that. And I was like, you know what? I can do this myself. And then I did 2 and 3. And I was like, no, I cannot do this myself. This is a lot of work. And I also suddenly felt this real pressure of having to have content every week and promoting it every week. And seasons 2 and 3, when I had guests also, those guests were, we're expecting to have, exposure from it too. So I also felt this pressure of like, I want to do good for my guests. Whereas season 1 was like, oh, it's just me. If like nobody listens to it, I don't really care. But season 2 and 3, I was like, okay, I promised people that people would listen to this. So now I got to make sure that people do. And so season 2 and 3 is where I started feeling a little bit of that. And then I took a break from it. And season 4, which I'm in process with Brian actually, to I was like, I wised up and I was like, okay, I need help. I can't do this by myself again. So I was like, Brian, can you help me? Season 4, I'm going back to the original format of here's, here, I'm going to drop a season all at once and reduce some of the burnout that way.
Great. Erin and Alicia, the same basic question for you. First of all, how long have you been producing the Two Elephants in the Room podcast? At any point, have you thought, this is just a lot of work and I got to shut it down?
3 years
or 4.
4.
I think 4.
It was the end of 2016.
Years.
It was the end of 2016. Yeah, so we're in our 4th year.
Okay.
And our focus has always been like, how can we help people like we do in our work every day? I don't know that we've ever thought we're not going to do this. We've taken breaks because just schedules get busy. And, we're never really hard on ourselves about it. It's just like, well, we're taking a break now. I think I originally had this idea of like a more planned out scenario of how we were going to work things out, but it's not realistic for our lives. And, just kind of adjusting to that has been really helpful for both of us.
Yeah. And not putting a lot of pressure, on ourselves either. So it's like, we'll make a plan for a season and we'll have guests and different things. But like Erin mentioned, we'll ease back as we need to ease back.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Great. Miller and John, I'm going to run the same question by you. How long have you guys been doing your podcast? And what have been the things along the way that have made you go, you know what, this is just a lot?
I believe we started in January 2015, so this is year 5. I think I'm looking at it's 218 episodes we're in, but for us, it's always been, Brian, I want to correct you. When you started, you said we work hard at this podcast. We're probably the exception. We're slackers and we try to do it as little as possible, and we try to keep it that this is for us. And I think that's been kind of our secret sauce, that, and we certainly have times when it's been exhausting, but we've only for the most part, I'd say 80% of the guests are people that we wanted to talk to or subjects we want to hit on. And also we felt like, and John we look at the numbers and John can talk probably a little bit more about this, but whenever we get stagnant or bored or something, we go back and just do a fun, dumb episode for ourselves. And those are the episodes that do the best, actually, numbers wise, when we like power rank dumb statues in Charlotte or something like that. But John, would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to keep it fresh and being honest with each other about what we're enjoying, what we're not enjoying. I'd say that's we kind of purpose built it and structured it from the beginning when we were first getting started to make it as easy as possible to get an episode out the door. So easy for me to say because Miller handles most of the technical load of the production, but early on we were really critical of kind of the format of what we were creating and saying like, hey, we like that, we didn't like that, that wasn't worth the work that we put into it, with the effort kind of anticipating the idea that we'd want to have this be something that lived and went a long time and went on for a while and be kind of constantly booking different types of guests. So we built it in a way that was like, hey, I got really energized and excited to come up with ideas for this segment. I wasn't excited about this segment, and just being really critical up front and in creating that format and finding what worked for us that we really enjoyed and looked forward to. So I think that was kind of been a founding principle for us and has led us to even when you're like, oh, I mean, Miller might be different, but I've never been like really, really dreading doing an episode because from the jump, it's been very easy to execute. So I think that.
Well, I've dreaded episodes, John. I'll correct you.
Well, there you go. Like I said, easy for me to say.
So I'm going to ask each of you, I'm going to ask you to pick one thing that you really love about doing your podcast that kind of keeps you motivated and keeps you doing it every time. And then I'm going to ask you one sort of pain point about producing your podcast. So one thing you love, let's start with a positive, and then let's really kind of dig into your pain points. So Erin and Alicia, how about you?
One thing that I love, honestly, because Erin and I are friends, sometimes it's like you just getting together with an old friend and you're able to talk. So I think that's the thing that I love. The thing that I'm not the biggest fan of, honestly, like the advertising part, like getting people to ask questions and getting people to engage, I think that's the tough part for me. Social media is not my thing. And I have a business to run and then my own account, then we have this account. And so I'm like, dang, did I put the post out? Did I use the right hashtag? So I think that's the pain point for me.
The thing I love is actually the same, like coming and talking to my friend. I was thinking like, I like sitting and talking with her. It's hard to sometimes come up with the topics because I'm like, I don't want it to all be like all the bad things that are happening right now, because I know people are struggling with their mental health because of the pandemic, because of the election cycle. So it's like trying to like talk about things that are not that. But I really enjoy coming and talk with her. But the struggle for me is more so like, what are we going to talk about that's not all doom and gloom all the time?
Yeah. Perfect. Bernadette, how about you? One thing you love about your podcast and a pain point.
One thing I really love about the podcast, which is why I started it, is the efficiency and being able to teach people and share my message and what I'm doing in a way that doesn't require people to be in front of a screen, which I think a lot of people are burned out with screen time right now. And also specifically when I have gotten those questions of people like, oh, can I pick your brain on how you did this or whatever? I'm like, oh, just check out episode so-and-so. And I just saved myself, $5 in coffee or whatever. Right. But one thing that I still struggle with is, to be honest, just getting myself to record the actual, and Brian probably knows this because I've been like stalling on recording the next season because, and we're talking about it in the chat box of, I don't love my voice. I don't know anyone that really loves their own voice, but I especially don't like mine. So, I got around that issue of, recording and editing and all that stuff by, outsourcing that, which has made it a lot more easy for me to focus on the content of it and how do I promote the podcast.
All right, John, let's start with you. So one thing you love about doing your podcast and a pain point.
Yeah, I think one thing I love, and again, go back to kind of how we've structured it. So we are a weekly podcast with guests. I think talking to new people is really the reason we started the podcast, and Miller and I both are just kind of curious about the city around us and are motivated we've kind of created this vehicle to reach out and have one-on-one conversations with people we find interesting. So being able to hear a fascinating story in the community and then have this reason to reach out to them and ask the questions that we want to have asked and learn more, I think is motivating, and kind of going back to what keeps us going is that. One thing I don't love, honestly, I'm realizing how much I enjoyed physically going to the studio and having that be part of the day. And getting to see Miller, he won't let me hear the end of that, but like getting to see Miller and hang out with him and like meet these new people together and just engage with a new person every single week in this kind of selfishly a environment that we control and are comfortable with and all of that. I miss that. So this kind of interaction is great, and it enables us to keep the podcast going and still meet the new people and have those conversations. But it's tough to not have that physical interaction and kind of the time before and after the microphones are on to talk. So I miss that. It's just kind of something that I look forward to getting back.
Miller?
I'm just glad this thing's being recorded, because I'll go back and clip that part, John, and we'll just put that as one episode, just 5 seconds of John telling
It's on repeat. It could be your ringtone.
I think what I enjoy the most, and hopefully people can see this, is John and I are true friends. We're a classic Twitter relationship. We met online and we actually found out our personalities matched and everything. We talk way more via text and talk calls and stuff than we do even in the podcast. And I think that's what's been kind of being able to work with him. And we also, in terms of a partnership with how we go about interviews, we have different passions about what we care about. And we also have different interview styles that work really, really well together. I think that's been kind of really beneficial and made it really enjoyable, where he carries a lot of the nuts and bolts and structural and economic questions that I don't really enjoy as much, whereas I get to do more of the personality and other things of the interviews. And in terms of things I don't enjoy, like people are talking about social media, stuff like that. We've leaned in a little bit into just using our personal accounts to push stuff out, but everything on our own social media for the actual podcast is just pretty bland. And we have tried to use producers and we've tried to bring other people in. I think keeping our team small has also been great. So that whenever we've had to rely on people, whether it's PR people to book or stuff like that, it's just become more difficult. When it's just the two of us, things are very simple.
Those are great answers, you guys. And I'm going to touch on a couple things that you guys kind of mentioned, and then I definitely want to get into some of the questions from our audience, because there's some great stuff happening in the chat room right now. But let's start, I guess, here. So everyone who launches a podcast has a vision that they're going to be Joe Rogan, or they're going to be, How I Built This, and they're going to have hundreds of thousands of downloads, right out of the gate, and they're going to make, all kinds of noise in the podcast scene. And the fact is, for most of us, it just doesn't happen that way. The average podcast, and obviously you can take, there's the Joe Rogans of the world on the right side, and then there's the rest of us. Apple says the average podcast episode over 30 days gets about 160 downloads in 30 days. Now you can look at that a couple different ways. You can look at it as like, wow, that's great. 160 people are hearing what I have to say. That's really cool. Or you can look at it as being only 160 people are hearing what I have to say. That kind of stinks. So my question to you guys is, and let's start with Bernadette, is how much focus do you put on the numbers? How much attention do you pay? Are you the kind of person who, when you release a new episode, you're constantly clicking on refresh and watching people listen to your podcast? Or are you the kind of person who doesn't necessarily worry that much about what your numbers look like?
Yeah, great question. I would say I don't even know what my numbers are, so that's probably indicative of the fact that I don't really look at it. And I think that's because, maybe the purpose of my podcast is different from how a lot of other people get into podcasting. My total business, which is Crush Your Money Goals, podcasting is, one of the channels that I use to do what I do, which is financial education. And I actually pay more attention to what the numbers look like on social media when I'm promoting the podcasts, because while I might not rely on every person listening to every podcast episode, I can get a sense of and I said this in the chat, what topics are resonating with people. If I drop an episode and I put like a little soundbite, or I put a little, quotation, from the podcast, and that gives me a really good sense of what content I should be putting out there. And actually, for me, if 160 people listen to the podcast, I'd be pretty happy with that, because for my business, I'm really focused. The core of my business is to help people pay down debt and work on their money goals. So if 160 people like paid off some debt because they listened to my podcast, I'd say that's pretty good.
Great answer. Erin and Alicia, how about you? Are you guys hanging on the numbers, or are you a little kind of play it cool about your numbers?
I think there was a point in time where I was a little more focused on that. But now my focus is, are we talking about things that matter, not just to us, but also to our listeners? And, getting caught up in the numbers was just distracting, because then I wasn't like really focusing on the content. I was focused on, how do I say this? I was focused on saying something that I thought was going to attract people, as opposed to saying something that I could speak very eloquently on and give a lot of good information on. And so my focus has shifted. I look at the numbers, but it's not something where I'm like, oh, I got to see who's listened or anything like that. I care about whether it's resonating, but I also care about that is something that I'm well versed in and I can give good information on.
Yeah, I have the same take on it that Bernadette mentioned. And I just want to reference too, because I see people mentioning like imposter syndrome. So I don't know if you guys saw in the chat that Erin and I are therapists. That's what we do for a living. And then I teach at a university. So for me, I'm all about getting the information out. So I care about that we are impacting people in that way. So if people listen and then that makes them want to check into their mental health more, then that's a win for me versus the number of listeners. So again, I'm really looking at impact. When people message us and they ask specific questions after hearing the episode and we can get them connected to a resource, like that's a win and that's success for me. Yeah.
Great answer. All right. I can't wait to hear this. Miller and John, numbers?
I'll let John go first.
Yeah, I think, as you might guess, like we're not big into the numbers. I think it's awesome and nice that people listen when they do, but I think Miller and I are really kind of intrinsically motivated. And like I said before about the building a vehicle to kind of force people to talk to us has kind of always been our motivation. I think we have looked at the numbers, not like we ignore them, but when we look at the numbers, it's more like, oh, wow, people really, it seems like when we talk about this type or genre of episode that we put together, like Miller mentioned before, we do just kind of when it's just the two of us talking, and it's been surprising to find that those do well more consistently than the guest one. So we've learned a couple things like that, but certainly don't let it dictate the decisions we make. I think you're kind of, if you chase numbers, you're getting closer to creating something that's going to burn you out. So the answer is we don't look at them much. I think they can be informative though, especially if you're doing something different like we have. So I don't make it central to content planning, I would say, but it's worth getting an eye. Like once you've built an audience, don't you want to know what they like and don't like, but don't let it control you.
No, John's completely right. We look at the numbers. We'll look at like past guests. If they all of a sudden start people listening to them, we know, hey, maybe we want to bring them back. But we occasionally, I'll just screen. John doesn't have access to the numbers, so he only.
I'm not lying. I'm not lying when I say I don't look at it because I can't. I'm too lazy.
I don't give him the login to anything. So I will just like screenshot it and send it to him, and it's always a good chuckle. But we're always blown away by the people who listen to us. And in your question when you started was asking about how large do we want to be, if we wanted to be the Joe Rogan or whatever size. And for John and I, our simple goal was just to create a platform where we could trick people into talking to us. And we found only one person has ever said no to coming on the podcast. And then they subsequently were primaried and lost their election. So that's karma. But we kept kind of that belief system. And that's what's kind of driven us. The numbers help back up who does well and stuff like that. But otherwise, for us, the numbers are just kind of in the background compared to actually, do we think the interview went well? Did we enjoy it? Did we get the message we want to get across, or did we learn something? That's the most important thing.
Hey, Brian, sorry, one thing that might be interesting that we have noticed about our numbers is that our backlog that I did not expect when we were starting out is that people listen to older episodes a lot more than I anticipated they would. So while you're creating new episodes, you're like, oh, this is new. Or even if you have like a repeat guest, you're like, oh, like people will be excited about this new one. That's not always the case. And when we do look at our numbers, kind of, it's interesting to see episodes from a year ago, 2 years ago, people are still actively listening to those. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that even though when you're creating something in your head, the content is fresh, the audience is looking at your backlog and your archive, and kind of to them it's this thing that exists and is kind of time independent of time. So just something to keep in mind that's kind of surprised me when we have looked at our numbers, is that it's not just the latest episode that people listen to.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Brian, but I was just
Nope,
gonna
go
say
ahead.
I agree. Quite a few people, we'll hear from them when we are like not in season or whatever, and they'll say, "Oh, we're just listening to old episodes until you come back." And so people do check your backlog.
Yeah, and I think podcasters forget about that, right? Like they'll be working on a new series or a new show or season or whatever, and they'll forget they've got a whole bunch of episodes that are still new to somebody, and then they don't promote those old episodes. So when you don't have something to promote, on a hashtag in case you missed it, hey, here's this cool interview, that we did with this person that, you might be interested in. So don't forget to promote your back catalog. I want to touch on Erin and Alicia on imposter syndrome. So a lot of us have it. And a lot of us think, well, why should somebody listen to me? Because who am I? What do I have to say? How do you guys recommend, maybe not necessarily overcoming imposter syndrome, but at least learning to live with it?
Well, yeah. So for me, when it comes to imposter syndrome, I have to remind myself that I never told anybody I knew everything, and that I'm always willing to learn. I'm always curious about things. And so, like I said, I'd like to talk about things that I feel pretty versed on, but I'm never going to pretend that I know everything. And, I'm sure you can find plenty of episodes where both of us have shared like, oh, I didn't know too much about that. Or, we're very honest. And I think sometimes it can get in my head, like just being a therapist in general. If I am helping people, how come I don't know how to use things on myself? Because no one can. We're not that objective with ourselves. And so just kind of humanizing myself and giving myself space to not be perfect is fine.
The analogy that I got from a friend is when you go to the grocery store to buy water, there's a ton of brands of water. And so don't forget that you are your own brand. And so as it pertains to like being an imposter, you are an expert on what you know, and there are going to be some other things in that category that you may not know, and that's cool. You're still an expert, and there's still someone that wants to drink your water. So keep putting your content out.
Somebody wants to drink your water. I like it. So we talked a little bit about the social media part, and someone I saw in the chat room said that producing a podcast is 20% making the podcast and 80% telling people about your podcast. And it's that kind of relentless self-promotion that can kind of get really heavy and hard to deal with. So Bernadette, as someone who has a podcast that's sort of part of your overall brand, you're promoting yourself 24/7. How do you sort of reconcile in your own head the amount of work that takes to letting people know that you have this thing and the amount of work you actually put into making the thing?
So that is a great question. I wrote it to myself. I'm like, I need to promote my back catalog. I have not done that in a while. So I'm learning from this as well. I mentioned this in the chat. I actually enjoy the social media aspect of it. That's probably one of the bigger parts of my overall brand strategy to begin with. And what I find, and I find this particularly true of women, which is, or women versus men, and because of what I do for a living, but I've noticed that, men aren't as afraid to start selling something, even if the product is not like fully there yet. Like they're good with the MVP. And a lot of the women that I work with, they won't start selling until they have a perfect product. And so I had to get over that real quick with what I do for my business. And I think that translated into the podcast of, and I think I can relate to what Erin and Alicia are saying, is that I am not putting myself out there as the expert of money per se. I'm putting myself out there as an expert in my own money experience, which is absolutely true. So that has made it way easier for me to cross promote everything, because what I do in my social media and my podcast is entirely based off what is really happening in my life. And it tends to be a lot more organic and even fun to have those conversations versus being like, oh my God, like, what am I going to, promote today? Usually what I'm promoting both on my social media and my podcast are like the thoughts that I've really had or the experiences that I've really had that I think might be helpful to someone else. And it takes a lot of the pressure off of like the whole promotion part of it. But I do 100% agree that if you want to, have listeners, and this is for any product, right? Because I also do YouTube and, other channels, is that people really underestimate the amount of time you need to do on promoting it if you actually want to get some traction on it.
Yeah. Miller and John, the necessary evil that is social media and podcast promotion.
We are not living in average times, so it's a good.
Bernadette, I was checking out your YouTube channel. I was interested on how to do this. That's what happens.
I was like, wait, that's my voice. What is going on here?
I got the dual
I was like,
monitors
am I
going
talking?
on. I was interested. See, we don't do YouTube. We don't do anything like that. John and I are the weird people who have Twitter brains, who literally that's where we met and we slid into each other's DMs, then had tamales and then started a podcast.
As one does, yeah.
Yeah. For us, like we lean into our own personal pushing out there. The podcast is for us, like the account is for things that can be shared by guests and things like that. Mostly from now, we found that we get more listens by having guests who have active accounts and getting them the resources they need to push it out there. But from there, it is really just using ourselves. Like John's really, really good at Twitter. And last year was voted best Twitter account in Charlotte. And he is anonymous as well. So this is the first time a lot of people have seen his face. So this is a big deal for him today. But he does a great job of finding people, connecting with them, and really getting those connections to our podcast as guests or listeners.
Yeah, I'd say, Brian, go back to the question about the percentage spent on the podcast and promoting it. I think you need to decide what you want out of the experience, because if your goal is especially like kind of test and learn and get it out there in front of as many people as possible and then adjust on the fly, but that method, obviously you do more promotion and social media than focusing on the podcast, right? But like your time is finite, so you might listen to those early episodes when you're more focused on promotion and be like, oh man, what was I thinking? Like structuring it that way, or you could kind of work on the craft as it is and kind of develop the show that you want, and then go out. So it's a decision that you need to make. That's kind of what we the approach we took was, hey, we need to get good at this first, and it took probably 35-40 episodes before it wasn't a bumfuzzle, but we got comfortable with our voice and kind of felt that once we had that, then it was appropriate for us to like go out into social media and start promoting it, because then we knew what we were trying to sell, right? Because we had put the time in to think about it. So it's a balance, and kind of our method won't work for other people that have different types of podcasts. They're trying to reach different types of folks, certainly, but that's kind of been our experience with it.
And Brian, that could be something we can get to later or hit now, but John talked about those 30 or 40 episodes. Like that's a really big barrier, and most people quit before then, but it took us that long to even feel like we were comfortable and had those reps. Like it's a pretty high threshold, but once you get past that, it becomes just like a muscle that you can like go in. The prep takes an hour, 30 minutes. You can write out the questions. From there, you record it an hour, and then you can edit, and it shrinks the time frame you're working on it. But it isn't as much mental effort to go through, and you're much more comfortable while recording. So you have to get to that threshold, but it becomes a lot easier, which helps. I assume people have burnout well before that, but knowing that that's there is certainly helpful.
I think there's a feeling probably for everyone, because we're human, that if we start something, we want to be good at it right away. We don't necessarily want to acknowledge that we need to train and practice and kind of get better at things, and how much of that is a factor. A few people have said that they I'm in the chat room, they've said that they don't like the sound of their own voice, or they don't like that they stumble around, or they don't know how to ask questions and things. And it's that sort of 10,000 hour rule, right? That you have to do things, repetitively to get better at that. How do you guys, or did you struggle with this, or how do you sort of, allow yourself to forgive yourself for not being really good at something right out of the gate? Start with Alicia and Erin.
I think the biggest thing is that I realize I'm not going to be good at anything right out the gate. And one of the things that I often say on the podcast is practice makes natural. And I still have to remind myself of that. But, I remember our first episodes in Alicia's apartment, I'm sitting there, we can't even get it started because I don't know the words to say. And now it's just like, hey guys, how everybody starts everything. But I also have this thing with myself where, I'm in the moment and I do the best that I can, and then I leave it at that. And I try not to criticize too much, because I could pick anything apart if I really wanted to. But why, when there's actually really good information, what I'm sharing, that can be beneficial to someone else.
Yeah. Yesterday I was sitting in session with one of my clients, and we were talking about failure. And I asked her, I said, does failure mean that you can't try again? Or does failure mean that you just didn't get it right that time? And so I think sometimes we get very caught up in, I'm going to do it this one time and one time only. And that's not life. If you talk and meet with other successful folks, they're successful at it because they've done it for a long time. And so not sticking to this idea that because I failed this one time, I can never do it again, but looking at it as this was an opportunity for me to practice, and the next time I'll get it. And if I don't get it that time, I can get it again. So yeah.
We try to actually live out the things that we talk about on our podcast. Sometimes it's a really good reminder. I guess that's something I can mention too that I really like. Sometimes us talking, I get ideas from her about things that I could do and ways that I can grow myself. But a lot, we try to live out the things that we talk about.
Yeah, I think we have to, like you said, allow yourself, give yourself the space to make some mistakes. I've been producing audio on the internet for 20 years. I worked, for 30 years in radio and television. And I still, I made a mistake the other day that I also would have made my first year, right out of college. And you have to be able to acknowledge those moments, learn from it, and don't just beat yourself up over making little mistakes. A few people have asked about, and we kind of mentioned earlier, and Bernadette, I think you mentioned too, kind of getting yourself a team of people. If you have the ability to bring someone in to do your editing, or record someplace, maybe there's a co-working space that has a studio or something. How much does that benefit you, Bernadette, with having people who can maybe kind of fill in some of the gaps that you have in your podcast production knowledge?
Absolutely. So one, it made me do it. Otherwise I would have stalled forever. I think what was really unique about my first season, which will forever be my favorite one until I do this season, hopefully, but is initially, my thought was to just, record my story and then kind of edit it afterwards. And I naturally enjoy talking. I can do that pretty easily. What Andy, who is a great producer, what he forced me to do that first season, he said, I think you need to script this out. I think we can make this really cool. It'll be different from, a lot of the other podcasts where we're going to have sound effects and other voiceovers and and I was like, whoa, that seems way more complicated than what I was thinking. I was thinking of just recording myself on my phone and you just clean up the background noise. And so the product came out way better than I would have produced on my own. And so I really think it's really great to have other people who do have ideas that maybe you wouldn't have thought of and have strengths. His strength is in editing, and he spent a lot of time looking there was one week he looked for 2 days for the right boing sound. I would not have done that. Right. And so, having other people who actually enjoy that, who nerd out on the pieces that you don't enjoy, can produce a better product overall.
A question from the group for John and Miller. You've recorded more than 200 episodes. That's a lot of audio. You guys may have realized that. And a lot of time podcasting. How do you work through different schedules? So obviously, the Miller, between you and John pulling your own schedule together, but also, some of the high profile guests, scheduling and booking guests, probably a bit of a challenge for you guys. How do you work through that, and what does your project management look like?
So when we started, there was one kid, and now there's 4 kids between the two of us. So that's the biggest thing, is trying to balance that. We, in working, and Brian, you deserve so much credit for what you're doing with Charlotte and podcasting, and working with you to be able to have the studio space that we can book and have a place that if it's at 4:00 that we can slide into at the end of our work day, and then still get home with what's the most important things, our family. Being able to do that's really important. But what we found, especially with being the times we're in, is we don't have that ability, and we don't really feel comfortable meeting in person with guests yet. So we've been doing everything at Zoom, and from there we do it at night. And we know the audio is bad, and we just understand that people are going to either take it or leave it. But essentially, we tell our guests essentially the time that we can do it and work backwards from there. That's helped with booking. And then also we book probably about a month out, which has been very helpful to get people on their schedule. So we're not trying to do the week or something like that.
Yeah, I'd say planning ahead. We're fortunate that when we have time, where we're kind of at a point now, 200 some episodes in, where we're like 4 to 6 weeks ahead of booking schedule now. It was in the beginning, it was more work to say like, okay, who are we going to ask on this time, and kind of have ideas and guest flow, I guess, if that's a term. But now, by virtue of planning ahead, I think by the time it's the week that we're recording, I certainly forget who we're talking to for that week's episode until the day before when we start prepping. But
yeah, we have a guest tomorrow night, and this morning we're texting to make sure we understand.
Yeah, like, who's it this week?
And that's not
so maybe we're not the ones that answer that question because we're kind of bad at it.
And I do project management for a living, and I would admit we're bad at it, but it works for us. Like, it's because we've done so many episodes that we've been able to figure it out. We know we know how to build a rundown really quickly. We know how, and what we tell every guest when they walk in is our goal is to learn from them. And also we tell people that we're not journalists, that we aren't media members, that we're just two guys trying to explore a city. And we start with probably only 4 questions and then let them take the conversation. The key with, I think it's really important when you have guests, the key with them is to understand the difference between a podcast interview, which is more like a conversation, and then like a media hit they've been doing where they're having to hit within a 4-minute or a 10-minute block. What we can do is we have 20 minutes to have the conversation. We can hit those 4 or 5 questions and let them take us where they want to go. So it takes a lot less planning when we walked into it with that expectation.
One of the things that I always recommend to podcasters is that you sort of stockpile episodes, right? So unless your podcast is super timely, and you're talking about like this weekend's football games or, events going on around town that are happening this weekend, if your podcasts are more sort of evergreen and can maybe live in the can for a little while before you release them, to have 6 or 8 episodes in the can already, so that you're not kind of working under that deadline pressure. How much does that deadline pressure contribute to to burnout, to feeling like, I've told my audience that I'm going to have a new show every Wednesday morning, and it's Tuesday night, I should probably record something. How important is it to avoid that sort of deadline pressure? Erin and Alicia, let's start with you.
Yeah, it's funny because we try to have set days that we're going to record. And so we'll say we're going to record on Wednesday, and if Wednesday doesn't work, we'll try to record on Friday. And every week I forget. And so Erin texts me to say, what time? And I'm like, oh yeah, this is the time.
But the funny part, I didn't know that. And a lot of times I'm like, oh my God, we're supposed to record today.
So one thing is having the scheduled time, right? Stockpiling episodes. We used to have a stockpile of episodes. I was just telling Erin before we started, it was just the 2 of us, and now the 2 of us have our respective families. So stockpiling episodes as well. And then honestly, just being transparent with your following. So like if it was supposed to come out, just send out a message just to let them know. And then you can give them something to look forward to in the next episode. So again, just taking the pressure off of yourself.
Bernadette, I'm sorry, you guys okay? Good?
Yeah, okay.
Right, good. Okay. Bernadette, deadline pressure.
Clearly I don't succumb to it because I have a deadline of releasing my next season like next week. That's not happening. So, that's all to say, right? If you guys in the chat, if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I have to keep this pressure on it. The only person who knows that you are messing up is really you. And now, all of you know that I was supposed do something next month, then I'm not doing it, right? But one of the reasons, and this is what I would challenge people to think about, again, why are you doing the podcast, and kind of what is the purpose and what is the messaging? And I, for myself, one of the reasons I decided to do the podcast on my own again this season versus like having guests every week and stuff is, one, I did not like doing the logistics and like having to remember to like show up with somebody else and all of that stuff. I also felt I kind of got burned out too, because from also just kind of coaching guests in the sense of like when I had people on the show, like some people who had never been on a podcast before would be really nervous and like, asking all these questions beforehand, which is all great. And I'm like totally for it and it usually works out well, but you don't have to go through that rigmarole if you're the only person on the podcast. And then I can be on my own time. And so I'm doing exactly what Brian had suggested, which is like, I'm trying to batch episodes. So every time I've been, going into to record my episodes, I do 2 at a time, but I also try to do it at a time where there is organic material. And so I think there is actually some benefit to not going on the weekly schedule and just, when you feel inspired to do so, to record those episodes. And that's worked out really well for me. And then what has happened, even with the last 4 episodes that I recorded that haven't been released yet, is that I realized after the fact, it would make more sense to rearrange the order of them, and also to time them with certain things that are happening in real time, in like real life, in the news and stuff. And so it gives me the opportunity to kind of look at it holistically as a whole season versus just 1 episode at a time.
Miller and John, you guys release on a fairly regular schedule. You produce live shows, you do all kinds of different stuff. How do you kind of manage when you record a podcast to when you release it?
Well, we generally schedule as we record Wednesday nights, and then we release on Sundays. And we've switched it up. It's probably every few months we change it, and we're honest with our audience that we have lives. And I think it's really important that we're not professionals. Even like if we do a sponsorship and we write out a contract, we don't put the specific days it comes out. Like we give ourselves grace, like in terms of being out living our lives about things that are far more important than our little podcasts, and not letting those get in the way. Perfect example is this past week, we were just going to do kind of a fun episode with the 2 of us. Like neither of us were feeling particularly inspired and needed like just a night off. So we took it and we didn't have an episode this week. And I think that's something really valuable. We don't bottle episodes. We do everything essentially the week of. Occasionally we'll get a couple interviews ahead, but for people who are doing podcasts or starting off, like you don't have to say, I want to put it out on Tuesday and only do Tuesdays. If you need to take a week off, or if you need to be a Wednesday or something comes up, like this shouldn't be the most stressful thing in your life. It should be fun.
Yeah, I'd say flexibility. Miller mentioned that we've recorded on a lot of different days. And I think, we've recorded on some days, Mondays, like our routine has been a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday at this point, and we've released on different days. So over 5 years, we've kind of been really flexible with whatever's going on in our lives. So, don't be afraid to do that. I would say find out. And I'd say too, if you're just starting out, just find a cadence that's natural, like for depending on what your content is and what you're comfortable with and when you can get in the studio or do it. Just find if you're more comfortable working under that pressure to do something on a routine basis, or if banking them, there's no downside to banking them, like you said, Brian, unless you're talking about current events. So don't be afraid to do that and be flexible and try a bunch of different ways and find what works for you. Like Miller said, it's supposed to be fun, and that shouldn't be what you should be worried about, your content and like making it the best, not about the administration of what day you record.
Yeah, I think it's if we're in this as a business, obviously then that makes it a little bit different, but the bulk of podcasters are sort of hobbyists, and there's no point in getting all stressed out over something that to your point, John, is supposed to be fun. We've got just a couple minutes left, but I do kind of want to touch on obviously the world that we're living in right now has its own stress, and then kind of adding to I have this thing that I started that I feel obligated and that I want to continue, but I also have a life and I have kids at home who need to be schooled, and I have a job and I'm holding on to my job, but how long am I? We've all got lots of things going on. how do you, Erin and Alicia, how do you guys balance pandemic-related stress to life-related stress to podcast-related stress?
So I think for me, with all those types of stressors, I know we've been self-cared out. Like we've heard self-care from every which angle. And there are times when I'm really good at that and like trying to create balance for myself. And then there's times when I'm not. And that is the time where I just grant myself grace and allow myself to be human and do whatever it is that I need to do. If that means that I need to just like take an hour and take a nap, I'm going to take a nap. I'm going to do whatever it is that I need to do to be able to manage myself a little better, because it is a hard time. Like Alicia mentioned on one of our podcasts that normally as a therapist, you have like past experiences that you can reference with your clients in session, but this is the first time where we're having like this collective traumatic experience all together, and we're having to navigate through it as we're working with our clients. And so taking that into consideration when we're doing our work and knowing that if we're going to have to be a support for other people, then we have to prioritize taking care of ourselves. And that's not just as a therapist, but also like knowing that our podcast is a support for people sometimes and being able to prioritize ourselves there as well.
I used to say that I'm trying to like balance. I got to balance this. I got to balance that. I got to wear this hat and wear that hat. But I'll stop saying that because there is no freaking balance. And now I just say I just try to catch the rhythm. And so sometimes my rhythm is mad good and I'm doing all the things. And another time my rhythm is way off. And I miss some breakfasts and I miss some working out time. So, my advice to you guys is just really just to catch your rhythm and figure out what you need during this time and just honor that.
That is spectacular advice. And just, I think too, just kind of be nicer to yourself, right? Give yourself the grace, give yourself the room to make mistakes. Don't be so hard on yourself, especially these days. Love yourself, love your friends and family, and just give yourself the space to just be human. I think really that feels like the overall notion of this whole thing is just stop being so hard on yourself. I want to thank you guys for joining us here this afternoon. It has been great. Alicia, Tetteh, right? How'd I do?
You got it.
Excellent, thank you. Alicia Tetteh and Erin Steele. They're from the Two Elephants in the Room podcast. It focuses on reducing the stigma of mental health. How can people find you on the socials and everywhere else?
We are two Elephants in the Room on Instagram and Facebook.
Yep.
That's pretty much what we do. And then also you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify,
Anchor,
SoundCloud, Anchor. Yes.
All right. Erin and Alicia, thank you so much for joining us. This is great advice. We appreciated having you. Bernadette, so you are from all kinds of places. You're everywhere these days. The Ask Bernadette Joy podcast coming up on the Queen City Podcast Network very, very soon. Tell us how people can find you.
I laugh. I'm like, when I get my ish together, yes, it will come out soon. You can find me and my handle here, Bernadette Joy, on Instagram and LinkedIn. Actually, is primarily where I do most of my social media, and you can see a lot of my. If you just search, Google my name, Bernadette Joy, you'll see a lot of the articles and stuff that I do for other outlets.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Bernadette, for your expertise and insight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And John and Miller, I'm going to start with you. Where can folks find you from the Charlotte podcast? Also on the
I think we're CLT podcast most everywhere. We're mostly on Twitter, Instagram, and then I'm at Miller Yoho on everything. John, you want to go from? Everyone should know that John is recording from inside his shed on his property, so that's his quarantine office.
Yeah. So when I'm not here, I'm not my all. Here looks pretty somewhere other than this shed at the back of my house. No, I mean our episodes are on different podcast platforms, and Twitter and Facebook CLT podcasts, like Miller said. Oh, and Instagram too. You can tell I don't handle that side of it. So, but yeah, check us out.
Miller and John from the Charlotte podcast. Thanks a lot, guys, for joining us and for your insight. We appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.
As I mentioned, my name is Brian. I'm with the Queen City Podcast Network here in Charlotte. And again, we want to thank you guys, so much for hanging out with us, for spending your lunch hour with us. We're going to remind you of the rest of the sessions this week, all through the virtual happy hour coming up on Friday evening. You can find out all the details and register for the remaining sessions at charlottepodcastfestival.com. charlottepodcastfestival.com. You can also buy a snappy new t-shirt if you like what you're doing. You probably noticed that all of the sessions during this month-long podcast festival here in Charlotte were free. Buying a t-shirt just kind of helps us do what we do here. Hashtag CLT Podcast Fest. If you are talking about us on social media, hashtag CLT Podcast Fest as well. Once again, this has been the Charlotte Podcast Festival, Charlotte's first podcast festival, presented by WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the Queen City Podcast Network, Blumenthal Performing Arts, and Eclex Creative Agency. Thanks again to our panelists. Thank you so much to you guys for hanging out with us, and we will see you tonight at the legal issues session at the Charlotte Podcast Festival. Thanks, everybody.